Hello, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg here today to do a book tag. I wasn't tagged in it, but I want to do it anyways, so try to stop me. It is the My Favorite Writers tag. This was created by, well, the original idea came from Alex of What Page Are You On? I will link his video down below. Steve Donahue turned it into a tag. I'll put his video down below. The video that I saw that inspired me to do this was from Brian at Bookish. I'll put that video down below as well. So the premise of this is that you are supposed to pick, you're supposed to end up with 15 different authors. I'm going to fudge the numbers a little bit. So you're supposed to pick 5 favorite authors, 4 authors who qualify as a maybe, and then 6 authors who would qualify as a kind of not quite. So I'm going to mess the numbers around, and I think I'm going to end up with 16 different authors instead of 15. And I've only chosen 3 authors for a favorite because to me, favorite is a lot. That says a lot if somebody gets into the favorite category. And so I reserve that very closely. There are some people in the maybes. I have a lot of maybes. So there are some in there who could very well break into this category. But to me, it's like a very exclusive realm. And the first author I'm going to talk about is probably one of my very first favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut. I have a lot of his books. I've read a lot of his books. I'm holding up Welcome to the Monkey House because, I have them lying flat on my bookshelf, and this is the one that's on the top. But it is also one of the ones that I like the most. His probably Mother Night is actually my favorite book of his, but I love so many of them. Slaughterhouse-Five is great. Breakfast of Champions is great. He has a couple of duds, but by and large, I like him, and I think he's a very unique writer. There are not a whole lot of authors who have a style that is similar to his, where it's very satirical, very funny, but very dramatic and affecting at the same time. I also think he has a really unique talent where he can tell you flat out, this is what the theme of this book is going to be. Usually, that would really irritate me, but something about the way he does it, I just really appreciate. So I read my first Vonnegut book when I was roughly 18 or 19, and that was probably right around the perfect time. That was Breakfast of Champions, was the first one I read. And I continued to devour most of his books. So for most of my 20s, I would tell everybody that Kurt Vonnegut was my favorite author. But sometime around my late 20s, early 30s, I think that started to shift. And now I would tell you that my favorite author is probably E.M. Forster. Now, I've talked about Maurice a lot. Technically, it is not, I think, E.M. Forster's best book, but it is the one that means the most to me because I read it at that perfect point in my life, and I've talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to go really into depth on it here, but it is just, it's a phenomenal book. E.M. Forster is definitely one of my, qualifies as a favorite writer along with Kurt Vonnegut because there's only one book of his that I feel kind of meh about. I have read Maurice, and it's wonderful. I would say his best book, objectively speaking, is Howard's End. This is a fantastic book. I really love this one a lot. It's, oh my God, it's so good. A Room with a View, fantastic. Another really great book. I just love so much of what he does, and so much. I've also read Where Angels Fear to Tread, which is a very slim book. I would say it's not great, but it's very good. The only book of his that I've read that I'm not really keen on is A Passage to India. And I think, dogs are walking around, I think part of this is that even though Forster he's a very humane person, he tries to be very, accepting and things. This is set in India, and I think, not through any fault of Forster's own, its portrayal of the Indians is it's pretty problematic from a modern perspective, and I couldn't really get past that. I also wasn't really that much of a fan of the plot of the book. I think it's fine. I just really didn't love it very much. But I love his work has a really great humanism to it, and I really appreciate that. And the third author I'm putting in my favorites is Jane Austen, because again, every book of hers that I've read, I've liked. I have not gotten to Emma. I really want to at some point. It's perpetually on my TBR. But I have not read Emma, Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, and I think, is it Sanditon? Those are the ones of hers that I have not read, but all of the ones that I have read are fantastic. I did not have a copy of Pride and Prejudice, and I found a copy in my used bookstore, local used bookstore that was cheap. You can't really tell because of the light, but I don't know why, but Mr. Darcy's a ghost on the cover of this version, so I don't know what that is. But of course, Pride and Prejudice is a great book. Sense and Sensibility is wonderful. And Persuasion, I think, is an underrated gem in her library. So if you haven't read that one, definitely check it out. I just think she's really funny, very sharp. I love the way she gets a lot of social commentary into her book, but they're entertaining in their own right as well. So those are the three authors that I would say are my favorites. Now I have a lot of maybes because there are some authors that I haven't read enough of their books to qualify them. I think the author who is probably most likely to make it onto my favorites at some point in the future is Toni Morrison, because I read The Bluest Eye this year. It was the first book of hers that I read, and I just loved it. I thought it was really good. I was kind of astonished that this was her debut novel, and I want to get to Beloved as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. I'm so eager to get to this book. I'm looking at a buddy read in December, and I really think she has what it takes to get up into that realm where she could stand alongside them. But the problem is, well, no, this is not the only book of hers I read. This actually was not the first book I read. I read Home, but the fact that I forgot it probably says a lot. It was a good book, not a great book. This was a fantastic book. But I've only read 2 of her books, so I feel like I can't really put her in my favorites until I've gotten a little further into her library. And then, moving along, somebody who's... I have read all of the books that have come out. I think I can't really say that he qualifies as a favorite author until I see what he does next, and that's Junot Diaz. So I absolutely love The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. I worked at Borders when this came out, and I read it immediately upon its release, and I would tell people about this book and recommend it to them, and they would look at me like I was insane, because when you tell people the plot of this book, they think it sounds weird. But then it won a Pulitzer Prize, and I felt very justified and vindicated in having recommended it to so many people, and I still recommend it to a lot of people today. It is a wonderful book. Drown is a great book. It's a collection of short stories. This Is How You Lose Her is kind of it's short stories. I think at least one of them is kind of long. I really loved this book very much. So I love all 3 of his books that I've read. The reason I'm holding out for his next book is because there has been a lot of criticism against him about his portrayal of women in his books. And I think that's fair. Women, he kind of crawls into their head. I would say some of the portrayal of women in here is an improvement, but it's not always great. And part of that is the characters that he is portraying, for sure, but it's still a problem area. I went to an author signing on the day that This Is How You Lose Her was released, and it is signed. And actually, there were some women in the audience it was like a sold-out standing room only crowd at Barnes & Noble in Union Square in New York City, and there were some women who called him out on that and were angry about the way he had portrayed women in his books. And he was very patient and he listened. I will say I have heard other people who were at two other people who were at events while he was on that tour say that women kind of pushed back at him and he got a little angry. What happened at the signing I was at was very different. So, and at that signing, he actually talked about how in his next book he wanted to write from a female character's point of view, and he was going to embrace his love of comic books a little bit more. I don't know if that's a project he would still be working on or if it's thrown away. It's been a long time since then. It would be an interesting idea. I think it's something that he would kind of need to address. He also had some problematic articles and accusations lobbied against him as part of the Me Too movement. So although I really do like the work he's put out so far, I think his next book is going to need to address the more problematic side of his work so far and maybe his personality so far. I don't know him, so that's why I feel like I can't count him along with the others. All right, and then we're going to move on to somebody who's... so I've only read 2 books by James Baldwin, but like Toni Morrison, I think he absolutely has what it takes to become one of my favorite writers. I just have only read 2. So I've read Giovanni's Room, of course, because it's probably one of his more overtly LGBTQ titles, and it is a very good book. It's not a happy read at all. If Beale Street Could Talk, also really not a happy read at all, but it is, I would say, a very important, urgent work. And there are so many of his books that I really want to get to. And once I've gotten a little further into his library, I absolutely think he can go from maybe to being one of my favorites. And then Edith Wharton. I've only read one of her books, Age of Innocence, and I just loved it so much. I think she absolutely deserves to be mentioned alongside Jane Austen a lot. She has that same sense where she's ostensibly writing a romance, but buried within this love story, there's a lot of really sharp social commentary. It's very smart. It's very deft. I will say, I think from Age of Innocence, she may be a better writer than Jane Austen. But I've only read one book, so it's really hard to say. I really want to get to House of Mirth at some point in the future and to just explore the rest of her books. She's another one who I think could very well be a powerhouse author once I've gotten to more of her work. All right, and then moving along in the maybes, we have Louise Erdrich. And part of the reason she's a maybe is that I absolutely love Plague of Doves. And I've talked about this one a lot recently. It's such a good book. It was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, and I think it should have won in the year that it was released. It's a fantastic book. So I started out on a high reading Louise Erdrich books. From there, I went to The Roundhouse, which I thought was good, not great, just good. And then from there, I read La Rose, which I got from the library, so I don't have a copy of it. And I was very meh about that book. So I'm kind of running a spectrum with Louise Erdrich right now, and I think I need to, once I get through some more of her books, maybe it can, because I don't like every Kurt Vonnegut book, but I would say he's one of my favorite authors. So I just need to work through some more of her books to see, and I definitely want to get to Love Medicine at some point in the near future, because this has been on my TBR for a really long time. So hopefully, once I get through a couple of those, I could figure out where I stand with Louise Erdrich. And then we have Jeffrey Eugenides. Now, he's kind of in a similar place as Louise Erdrich, because I absolutely love The Virgin Suicides. The glare is making this very difficult to see. I have a movie tie-in of this, but it was really all that was available at the time I bought this. I love The Virgin Suicides very much. I really liked Middlesex when it was released, and I was very happy that it won a Pulitzer Prize. I feel like I need to do, this is part of why he's in a sort of limbo for me. I feel like I need to do a reread on this, because since this book was published, our understanding of intersex has changed. We use the term intersex. In this book, he uses hermaphrodite, which is not a term we use anymore. So part of me wonders, since this book was published, how would we look at it differently? Because so much has changed. And, I think a lot more has changed for, say, transgender people when it comes to the LGBTQ spectrum. Intersex is still kind of in the shadows, but our understanding has really improved. And part of me wonders, would this book be problematic if I went back to it? I don't know. I have to go back to it in order to make up my mind. And then there's the marriage plot, which I think is well written, but I really did not enjoy. I really did not enjoy this at all. I get that he was trying to do something different. I saw him speak at the 92nd Street Y with Jennifer Egan, and he had talked about how in his books, say The Virgin Suicides, he was playing with the idea of voice, because The Virgin Suicides is narrated by multiple different boys, which is a very unique way of narrating a story. So he was playing with narration when he wrote The Virgin Suicides. When he wrote Middlesex, he was playing with the idea of story, because it's a really big, epic story. I mean, you could tell. And that's what he wanted to play with when he was writing Middlesex. And then when he was writing the marriage plot, he really wanted to dive into character. The problem is, I don't like any of the characters in this book. He was also really thinking about old classic romances, like, say, the ones by Jane Austen or Edith Wharton. And I just think a lot of this book ended up falling flat, which was disappointing. He released a collection of short stories called Fresh Complaint, which I have, but have not read. So this might help clarify some of where he stands for me. I just haven't gotten to it yet. So we'll have to wait and see. And then another maybe, again, I have a lot of maybes, is Cormac McCarthy, because I read The Road when it was released, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I know a lot of people have since then kind of cooled on The Road a little bit. For me, I remember absolutely loving it. I should probably reread it at some point. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. And then I read No Country for Men after that, and I thought it was really good. I did not love it as much as The Road. I thought there were some parts of it that kind of fell flat, and it's interesting because some people disagree with me on this. I feel like The Road has an element of hope to it. Some people disagree with that, and I feel like No Country for Old Men is just bleak and pessimistic and cynical, and that can be a bitter pill to swallow. So although I appreciate it, it's still kind of difficult to get in. I really want to read Blood Meridian. This is one that a lot of people say is their favorite book by his, like a contender with The Road, and I it's been on my TBR for roughly 10 years. So I really have to get to it. And I think once I get to this one and maybe one or two others, it can clarify where I stand on him. Some people think he's really difficult because he doesn't use a lot of punctuation. I don't have much of a problem with that. All right, and then we get to Kazuo Ishiguro because I love The Remains of the Day. I thought this was a great book. I love Never Let Me Go, although a lot of people have a kind of problem with this. They think it's a little bit on the boring side, kind of meanders. I absolutely love it. But I've only read 2, and because I've only read 2, I need to get further. I bought a copy of A Pale View of Hills earlier this year. Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse was talking about The Buried Giant at some point earlier this year, and it made me really want to read The Buried Giant as well. There are a couple more books of his that I feel like I need to get to before I can really say which way I'm leaning on Kazuo Ishiguro. Next, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I've only read 1 book of his. I have Love in the Time of Cholera because this is one I need to get to. I've read 100 Years of Solitude, and let me tell you something. 100 Years of Solitude is an amazing book. Really good. I love it. It's up there among my favorites. My favorite books kind of move around over time, but it's always in contention for it. So I need to read more of his books, and I want to start with Love in the Time of Cholera, and then get to a lot of his other books because I feel like, kind of like Toni Morrison, once I get further into his library, he could very well be among my favorites. And then the last maybe that I'm going to talk about is Jhumpa Lahiri, because I love Interpretive Maladies very much. This is another book that's up there among my favorites. I don't think it's as high as 100 Years of Solitude, but it's up there in my favorites. And I absolutely love it. I love The Namesake, which I don't have a copy of right now. But I really like it. I wouldn't say I love it. The thing that makes her a maybe for me is the Lowland, because I read this. This is an advanced copy of it. I read this. I don't remember anything about it. And so maybe I need to reread it because I don't remember disliking it. It's just that I don't remember it. So I feel like I need to reread this, maybe read one more book that she will have released, and then I can decide where I stand on her as well. But she's definitely in contention. So then we get to the people who are not quite. Now I'm supposed to pick 6 of these. I only have 3. The first not quite is Annie Proulx, because I love Annie Proulx as a writer. I think her writing is fantastic. It's brutal and sparse in a way that maybe Cormac McCarthy could touch, but not many other writers could compete with. Close Range is a fantastic collection of short stories, includes Brokeback Mountain, which of course was adapted into a movie. She won a Pulitzer Prize for The Shipping News, which kind of left me cold. And that's a little bit where I stand with her. I love her writing. I don't always love the books. So I was cold on this, loved Close Range. Barkskins I thought was half of a great book and half very meh. So there are still a couple of her books that I have not read. So it's possible my opinion might change, but as of right now, I think this is pretty firmly a not quite, because I love her writing, not always the books. Another one that I would say is not quite, although this could change once I read more, is Barbara Kingsolver, because The Poisonwood Bible is one of my favorite books. Absolutely love this book. If you have not read it, I absolutely recommend it. I remember reading, The Bean Trees, and liking it, not loving it. I really want to reread it though, because I just recently found out that it has a sequel, and I'd love to read that. I want to read The Lacuna. There are a lot of her books that I want to get to, but some of the other ones that I've read are okay. I really liked Unsheltered, which I read way earlier this year, but I think it's kind of flawed. So again, kind of like with Annie Proulx, it's like I really like a lot of what she does, but not enough to say that she might be one of my favorites. And maybe that I think Annie Proulx is pretty definitely in the not quite category. For Barbara Kingsolver, that might change. And another one that might change is Jose Saramago, another Nobel laureate. When I first read Blindness, when did I read Blindness? Somewhere around 2004, 2005, maybe even 2003. He had definitely already won the Nobel, which apparently he won in 1998. and I read it a couple of years later. So, but I absolutely loved this book. I definitely called it one of my favorite books of all time. I've cooled on it since, because sometimes when I look back at it, it seems I had a big emotional reaction to it when I read it, and then I've kind of cooled on it a little bit. Basically, I was really, your enthusiasm gets really up and you're wild about something, and then when you get a little distance from it, you're like, yeah, it was good. That's kind of how I feel about this, and I really want to reread it to see if my initial reaction was right or the cooling is right. I also really want to read The Stone Raft. I've heard great things about this book, and I think right now Blindness is the only one that I've read, and because I cooled on it, I'm putting him in not quite, but maybe he should qualify as a maybe instead. But yeah, I really want to read The Stone Raft. The only other book of his I've read is The Tale of the Unknown Island, which is an itty bitty pocket book that's maybe 50 pages long, and it was fine. It's basically a short story that got packaged as a book, and I thought it was fine, but that's about it. So I really want to read The Stone Raft. He has other books, Balthazar and Blumunda, that I really want to read. Does he have The Gospel According to Jesus Christ? I believe he does. So there are a lot of his books that I want to get to. So kind of like Barbara Kingsolver, he might work his way out of the not quite category, but for now it seems like that's a natural fit. So those are the massive piles of books that show you who my favorite authors are as part of this tag. I don't usually tag people. I'm not going to do any tagging today. I will just say, if you're watching this and you want to do this tag, do it. That's all. And if you like any of these authors, let me know. Let's enthuse about them together. If you dislike any of these authors, let's fight about it. Drop me a comment and tell me, well, don't tell me I'm an idiot. But let's talk about it. And if you have recommendations based on any of this, I'd love to hear that as well. So thank you for your time watching this video. As always, it is very appreciated, and I will be back again. Until then, happy reading.